Good evening, and welcome to the third lecture or conversation in the series of Center for Urban Engagement events this semester. A few weeks ago, many of you were able to join us for Taya Miles' lecture on her wonderful book, The Dawn of Detroit. And then shortly after that, we hosted Carrie Arsenault and Garnet Cadigan for a conversation about Carrie's book, Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains. And tonight, we're honored to have Reuben Miller here with us in order to discuss his book, Halfway Home, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. The format for tonight's event will be another conversation, just like we had with Carrie and Garnet, except that it will be moderated tonight by two conversation partners that we have invited in. Dr. Mary Yeboah is the Director of Graduate Student Life at Wheaton College, where she partners with graduate faculty and staff to provide an enriching educational experience for graduate students in and out of the classroom. Her professional career includes K-12 teaching and school leadership among culturally and linguistically diverse student populations in the United States and abroad. Mary currently serves on the board of Justice for Keith Lamar, which seeks to free Keith Lamar from a wrongful death sentence and mobilize action to end mass incarceration. Mary is also a leader here on campus in our conversations about potential future initiatives regarding prison education and engagement of mass incarceration as a topic of advocacy, activism, and education here at the college. She's also someone who is civic-minded and a civil servant who is currently running for school board, and we thank her for joining us today, especially on Election Day. Dr. Aaron Griffith is Assistant Professor of History at Sattler College, where he teaches courses in American history and the history of Christianity. He is a former postdoctoral fellow at the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, and instructor at the university's Prison Education Project. His first book, God's Law and Order, The Politics of Punishment in Evangelical America, was published by Harvard University Press in 2020. You should go out and get yourself a copy of Aaron's book. Aaron is also an alum of our center's program, Wheaton in Chicago, and of Wheaton College. We're proud of the work that he's recently done. And finally, Reuben Jonathan Miller is a sociologist, criminologist, and social worker who teaches at the University of Chicago in the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. He studies and writes about race, democracy, and the social life of the city. Miller has been a member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a fellow at the New America Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin and Dartmouth College. And he's here to talk with us, as he's been talking with so many recently, about his book, Halfway Home. So please join me in welcoming virtually our three conversation partners tonight, and I will turn it over here to Reuben, Mary, and Aaron.
Great. Thanks, Noah. It is great to be here with you all, and I'm really excited about this conversation. And I just want to begin by saying right at the outset that Dr. Miller has written a remarkable book, Halfway Home. It's a book that you should all go out and buy, not right now, but immediately after this event. It's a book that it's powerfully written, and it's one that sheds light on oft overlooked realities of the American problem that's come to be known as mass incarceration. And the statistics relating to mass incarceration that are frequently mobilized might be familiar to some of you, maybe not to others. Around 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country, 40% of whom are Black and 84% of whom are poor. But these are numbers. And they're numbers that so often in public discourse focus our attention on an institution, that of the prison. And what Dr. Miller has given us in Halfway Home is not only an exploration of the prison, but a deeply personal, profoundly human exploration of the cost and experiences of behind statistics like these, the ways the power of these numbers, as Dr. Miller puts it, extend far beyond the jail, the court, and the prison yard. We're going to start. Dr. Miller has graciously agreed to begin our time together with a quick reading from Halfway Home, and then we'll pick it up after there with some questions, and we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Reuben Miller.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to Professor Tolley for the, and also to Professor Griffith for the introduction. And thank you to Carrie Vanderveld for organizing this talk, even through a year-long pandemic delay. But Wheaton is tenacious. And thank you to Dr. Yeboah, who is here on election day. That's the whole thing. I very much appreciate that. And I'd also like to just shout out some old friends that likely may not be on this call, but props to Professor Allen, who I had the pleasure of sharing a few meals with, and Professors Miller and Howell, all three of whom I had the pleasure of working with as an adjunct in the sociology and anthropology department some years ago, maybe a decade. And so Professor Griffith sort of laid out some of what I'm trying to do in the book, and we'll talk more deeply about that in a bit. But I want to share a reading from chapter 3, which is the chapter called Centerman, and I want to bring you into the life of one of the folks who will follow. And the reading opens in January of 2014. It's in Detroit. I'm doing research out of the Detroit Reentry Center and the Detroit Detention Center. The Detroit Detention Center is a centralized lockup facility for everyone who gets arrested in the city of Detroit at the time. And so what happened was, because of abuses of human rights that were happening in lockup facilities with no working toilets or one working toilet, facilities with no working lights, so much so that jail guards, that detention guards would have to go from cell to cell with a flashlight to look for folks when it was time to get them arraigned for court. That the city of Detroit was under a consent decree, and the state of Michigan took over the lockup facility. So this is one of the places where I was, the newly taken over lockup facility. And at this point, it's a well-oiled machine, and I'd meet men on their way home. I'd meet them on the day of their release. Sometimes I'd wait with their families. Sometimes I'd head to the muster room. This is the cell where people who were about to be released waited for the final buzzer and the final gray steel and plexiglass door to slide open. They didn't know that their loved ones were on the other side of that door, eating overpriced concessions, waiting to pick them up. The final door would buzz and slide open, and the men and women inside would walk out to reunite with their loved ones. A father would hug his boy close. A grandmother would reach up from her seat to embrace her long since grown child, her walker between them. Children weren't often there, but there was always some exchange between the people released from their cage and the people who picked them up, even when they were in a hurry to leave. There'd be some intimate conversation or just a few words between each parent, maybe a nod or a glance or eyes that danced nervously from a lover to the floor, or maybe a parent would acknowledge how much a child had grown since the last transfer. All of it signaled that their loved one was known and cared for, even if he made a mistake, and even if she hadn't visited in some time. Some people made a beeline for the exit, their loved ones trailing close behind, but the relief on their faces when that last door buzzed was almost always there. They had been in prison, but now they were on their way home. Taking in this scene, I almost missed Jimmy Caldwell, who walked out of the detention center alone. It took 4 tries to reach Jimmy. The call dropped twice, then his phone was out of service. After a few days, I got a hold of his mother, who was warm and passed along the message. Jimmy called back quickly. He showed up early and had a cup of coffee in the waiting area at the University of Michigan's Detroit Center in Midtown, where we had our first interview. Everyone who met him commented on how nice he was. Stocky man, he appeared somehow short, vulnerable, though he was 5'10" and of medium build. He hung on every word as if it mattered in some profound way. He smiled easily and joked often, but not so much that you didn't take him seriously. And while he looked at you directly when you talked, he never made eye contact. I invited him from the table where he was drinking coffee with lots of cream and sugar to the room where we would have our first interview. We covered the basics in short order. He had a 10th grade education and had been arrested at least 20 times. It started when he was 16. High school was hard. He tried Job Corps, but it wasn't for him. He sold dope, used dope, and went to prison for property crimes. After a 3-year sentence for grand larceny, he finished a 6-month drug treatment program. He was happy about completing treatment, and he used lots of treatment language. He talked about people, places, and things, and codependence, and enablers, and my madness, and my disease. I wanted to know about his life, but I needed to get beyond the things he learned to say to people in treatment groups and beyond the stories you hear when you watch Black gangster movies from the 1990s, like the hard and tragic life of violence and addiction that poor Black kids are presumed to find themselves in every day. Black life in cities like Detroit has been so caricatured, and these caricatures have led to bad policy, welfare reform, the war on crime, a million mentorship programs that try to replace missing Black fathers. This is despite 2 decades of research that show that Black fathers are there, that Black fathers help with homework and go to games and share moments of affection like all fathers. In fact, studies show that Black fathers spend more time with their children than fathers from any other racial group, even when they have multiple children, and even when those children have different mothers, what social scientists call family complexity. But the news about exceptional Black men who teach low-income kids complicated handshakes, and the YouTube clips of white principals doing the latest dances with little Black girls and boys, and the viral videos of police officers playing basketball with kids in dreadlocks, and the memes where 100 Black men show up for the first day of school with a prominently displayed caption like "real fathers" or "real Black men" convince us that this is abnormal. And it's not just bad policy. Lessons from 1,000 studies on missing Black men and 1,000 more on what sociologists call social disorganization show up in the first interview. So do slogans that moralize Black life, along with phrases like, "you know how we are," and some version of "what our people really need to do is." And they're the things that preachers and pundits and presidents say at gatherings of Black men. All of this shows up within the first hour of the interview. Social scientists might call this social desirability bias, meaning people tell you the stories they think you want to hear. There are interview techniques to get past all of this, but it takes a while to move beyond the noise in people's heads, and it takes more than a few hours and a few cups of coffee to really learn about someone's life. I had a plan. I would ask Jimmy about his family and about what it was like for him to grow up on the east side of Detroit. I'd ask him about the city and how it had changed since the last time he was locked up. And I'd ask what it was like for him to come home. I'm the only boy, he said confidently. He had 4 sisters. When I asked where he was in the pecking order, he sat up in his chair laughing. "I'm the baby." "You're the baby?" I said, thinking I knew what he meant. When I told him, "I'm the baby too," we laughed together loudly, 2 middle-aged men sitting in an office in Midtown, decades removed from our childhoods, thinking about some pleasant thing from so long ago. But Jimmy stopped laughing abruptly. I was surprised by how quiet he got, how quickly the mood changed. He wiped his eyes, sighed, leaned his head on his hand. "So," he took a long pause, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I was kind of spoiled. I got pretty much everything I wanted." 30 seconds of silence. Jimmy was full on crying now, no longer bothering to wipe his face. His dim brown eyes red and full, his voice soft and broken. He went on. "So when crack came, it was a lot of disappointment, I being the only boy." "Is that why you're upset?" I asked. What a dumb question. I didn't really know what to say. There was a grown man crying in my office. I handed him the box of tissues we kept for times like this and sat with him in silence. "It's not where I want to be right now," he whimpered after a while. "My sisters, they getting there. It's getting there, you know." I wanted to know more. He told me his sisters had helped raise him and that they were close growing up. He wanted to keep it that way, but that's not how things turned out. "Everybody kind of looked up to me," he explained, back to wiping the sides of his face. "Like I said, it was a lot of disappointment. Time after time, they give me the benefit of the doubt. Basically, I shit on them." "What about your parents?" I asked, trying to find my bearings. "Well, my father, he was married, but he wasn't married to my mom. I got 4 sisters," Jimmy said, explaining they were his half-sisters. That is, they were not all his father's biological children. His mother had children from a previous relationship, and his father had a family of his own. "He took care of 2 families," Jimmy said. "He treated all my sisters like they were his. He go home, but I've seen my daddy every day." "Were you close?" I asked. "Yeah, we was close at the time," he said. Jimmy's father died when Jimmy was young, cancer. He was 82 or 83, he said. Jimmy was just starting high school then. He was 14 and at a new school with a mother raising 5 children. Things started getting different. I don't know if it was because my mother didn't really know how to raise a boy. I was the baby, so if I want it, I'm gonna tell my daddy and I get it, he said. But after my father died, I stopped getting all the perks, Jimmy said. Jimmy's father was an auto worker at a time when people still had pensions. His mother made Jimmy and his 4 sisters take their dead father's last name to ensure that they would be taken care of financially, in Jimmy's words. But there were no more perks other than the few $100s that came in the mail each month from the Social Security office. And that went to Jimmy's mother. Jimmy's father, the man who Jimmy saw every day, the one who took care of his sisters as if they were his own, was gone. I wanted to wear all the good shit like I've been wearing, Jimmy said, but it wasn't that kind of party. It felt like everyone was against me, so I started doing dumb shit. Jimmy would wait for the mailman to come each month. I figured, well, that's my check. I should be able to do what I want with that money. And I wouldn't think about bills or none of that, he told me, reflecting on his route into trouble. This was the reasoning of a 14-year-old boy, one who didn't realize that the mailman was delivering his check, or that the place where his father developed cancer might have some responsibility toward his family. And it wasn't just his family. Cancer rates among Black auto workers rivaled rates in the famed Cancer Alley, that 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River of petroleum refineries and chemical plants that claimed the lives of a generation of Black men. Auto workers were dying. Leukemia, colon and pancreatic cancers, lung cancer, cancer of the stomach, cancer of the liver, brain cancer, cancers of all kinds claimed the lives of so many Black people in Detroit. Started to steal, he said. Like me and the other guys in the neighborhood, when the mailman come, we take the mail. Tried to cash the check ourselves. A whole group of boys had lost their fathers to the auto plants. The same plants that convinced the government to use eminent domain to demolish 1,500 homes in Detroit on the promise of good jobs in the 1980s. These same plants provided just a fraction of those jobs, then packed up and left. The same auto plants did not cut checks to the boys' families, but went to the Capitol with their caps in their hands during the Great Recession to ask the government for a check, and they left with one. Jimmy and his friends stole the meager Social Security checks the state sent to their mothers. But that plan didn't work, Jimmy said. No one would cash the checks. So there the boys were, their names on checks their dead fathers had earned, with no way to access the funds. That's when I left high school, he said. The rest of the story is predictable. Jimmy ran the streets, stole, and started selling dope. By 16, he was using. By 17, he'd been to jail. By 18, he was in prison. He lied to his family and lost jobs. He stole things from people's homes. He used more drugs and did time over and over again. 6 months for stealing car radios, 12 months for drug distribution, 18 months for grand larceny, dozens of arrests for trespassing, for using, for stealing scrap metal, for not reporting to his parole officer on time when he was high. Jimmy stayed with his sisters in between bids because he loved his nieces and nephews. Having no children of his own, he spent as much time with them as he could. And the kids wrote to Jimmy when he was locked up, sending pictures and visiting as often as they could. But over time, it became more difficult to support. Jimmy told me that worse than the guilt for stealing and using and lying, worse than all the consequences that came with it, was the separation he felt from his family. A lot of time with my addiction, I wouldn't come around. It's a lot of hurt. They were saying, don't leave, he said. But after a while, they learned what to expect. Jimmy would disappear for months at a time, then call collect when he ran out of money or knock on their door when he got out of jail. When he showed up again, the kids were older, and he was older too. He was middle-aged now, and the kids were grown. They had lives of their own. And despite the challenges and the separation he felt, every time he was arrested, he was proud of them. I gotta say, all my nieces and my nephews, everybody doing good. They can be successful, he said, looking to the side with a smile. I want to leave it here on a high note. I'm tired of the crying. I didn't want to be in doom and gloom. I wanted to leave on a high note. What did they do? I asked while he was smiling. One niece lived in Pontiac, Michigan, suburb of Detroit. All his nieces and nephews had families and worked. One was gonna, he said he finna sign a record label or record deal. Wow, I said, happy to hear the news. Jimmy beamed when he talked about the kids, and I wanted to end our time together at this point while it was happy. He put his head down and teared up again. What makes you sad about that? I asked, surprised at the sudden shift. I don't know. He took a breath. I guess I'm happy on that part. His voice breaking. Jimmy said, but it's hard. I look at myself and all the potential that I had, how I let myself down, and I feel like, wow, I got left behind. I understood. Jimmy had spent 20 years cycling in and out of different kinds of cages, workforce preparation programs, mandated substance abuse treatment programs, prisons all across the state. One was a 5-hour drive from home. He was in a halfway house, jails, detention centers, almost everything in between. All this time, the baby was separated from his family. Jimmy was all alone, and he had felt this way since he was 14 years old. He sat in my office quietly for another few minutes. He wasn't crying anymore, but his head was down. He was looking off to the side of the room. He sighed, turned his head, and looked at me directly, this time making eye contact. You're not the only one doing time, he said. They, meaning his family, get tired too. The problem of mass incarceration has never really been about crime. It's that the people who Americans are afraid of are subject to a separate set of rules. They live in a separate and altogether different social world because they belong to a different political economy. No social service agency, no matter how well funded, can bridge the divide between these two worlds, nor can any one of our criminal justice policy reforms. We have not yet come to grips with our problems or imagined an adequate response because our assumptions about the extent and causes of crime have been wrong from the beginning. You cannot treat or arrest or perhaps even reform your way out of mass incarceration because mass incarceration is about citizenship, not criminal behavior. And citizenship is about belonging. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reuben. I want to start with a question that I think as you tell this story of Jimmy and as you reflect some on the ways we've misunderstood the problem, I'd love to hear you just talk about some of the overarching goals you had in writing Halfway Home, and maybe with reference to some of the conversations that have been going on around how to understand the growth of prisons or how to understand crime and punishment, whether on a scholarly or popular level. And I just love to hear, like, what did you want to do with this book that had not been done before? And maybe when did you know that there was a new narrative that needed to be paid attention to here?
Sure. When I started doing the research for the book, I was a graduate student, and all the work was about the prison, which is very important. In fact, my initial foray into research, I wanted to study religious conversions in prisons. This is what I wanted to do when I first got started, and maybe I'll come back to that at some point in my life. But all the work was about prisons. All the work was about police and policing and arrests. And this is very important. We've learned a million things from this work. We've learned that prisons make you sick. We've learned lessons for COVID-19 had we paid attention, because we knew from the public health research that something like 1/3 of all communicable diseases in a given year pass through an American jail or prison first. And we know that prisons are incubators, for example, of chronic and communicable diseases. So we knew this. So therefore, we knew we were issuing death sentences when we kept people in what have now effectively become death camps in American jails and prisons, because we knew HIV rates were 5 to 7 times higher, tuberculosis rates were up to 9 times higher, the hypertension and high blood pressure were higher. We knew that people reported worse health in the year after they left the prison than they did in the year before. We knew since 2013 that for every year someone spent in a prison in New York State, they lost 2 years off their life expectancy. This is incredible. Prisons literally kill people. Not to mention the disabilities that I would see when I follow people on the outside. But what we didn't pay much attention to was the way that imprisonment changes the social life of the city. We weren't paying much attention to the way our lives look fundamentally different. The way that crime and punishment has made it so we find it acceptable that men live under a bridge in San Francisco because they committed a sex offense. In other words, how it's warped our moral compasses, how it's changed the way we view one another, how it's broken our relationships with one another. And so when I started following people home, I realized there was something to it. And then when I started counting, when I started paying attention to the number of people who lived in communities like mine, I was born poor and Black after 1972. And so I was born into what we would call a mass incarceration generation. 1972, of course, being the year that mass incarceration begins in earnest, where we arrest more people at a higher rate every year for 27 straight years. And so if you're born in that period, if you're of working age at any moment in that period, so really between about 1962, 63, and now, if you're of a mass incarceration generation, you're likely to be in jail or prison. And 60% of my friends and family who don't graduate high school because of racial disparities in it would end up in a jail or prison. So I knew that was the case. But what I was met with was the fact that in some neighborhoods, the so-called $1 million blocks, where we call people into jails and prisons, that something like 80% of the men in that neighborhood will have been to a jail or prison. And so you've got 19.6 million people who have a felony record, alive with a felony record. That's a number 5 times the size of the jail and prison population combined. All of our attention right now. This doesn't mean that the prison isn't some place to attend to, but all of our attention is to the prison and not to the society that the prison shapes, this thing that I call a supervised society. So that's when I knew, when I started paying attention to the numbers of people and, by the way, their experiences. When I started meeting the Jimmys and the Sabrinas and the Yusefs and the Ronalds and the folks that we meet in the book, I knew for sure that we had to change the way we think about and talk about this issue if we ever want to solve it.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. And before I ask this next question, which dovetails right off of that, I do want to say I'm aware that you've attempted an audiobook version in the past. And if tonight's reading is any indication, I think you should go ahead and give that another try.
I appreciate that very much.
But let me move on. In the appendix of your book, you say, quote, "It is an attempt at a sociology of being together." Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that and how you went about doing your research, of course, a 15-year study, especially in light of some of the journalism you indicated that attempts to diagnose the problem with the neighborhood, sometimes after just a 3-day visit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The famous Walensky article visits the west side of Chicago, spends 3 days there, and writes an article called "What's It Like to Be in Hell?" This is the what can you know about this neighborhood in 3 days? What can you know about the people? Thank you so much, Mary, for teeing up that question in that way. So I mentioned that you know, my own life and experiences intersect with this book. And so I cut my teeth on this work as a volunteer chaplain in the Cook County Jail. This and a scripture motivated me to be here. It was Matthew 25. You know, this is the quote valley of decisions, the valley of decision. You know, where nations are gathered, sheep and goat nations, and you know, and the sheep, for those that are welcome to the beloved, are the ones who feed the hungry, clothe the naked, attend to the sick, visit the prisoner. And my little church, I went to a tiny Pentecostal church, and we didn't have a prison ministry. And I asked my pastor if we could start one, and she said yes. And so I went and helped and joined a prison a chaplaincy group, a group called Chaplains for Christ. It was an organization of beautiful men. Wonderful people who dedicated their life. I mean, they had their problems, right? Like everybody has their problems, but on balance, really wonderful folks who would visit jails and prisons across the country, and specifically in Chicago, but actually all across the world, and spend time there. And while I was doing this chaplaincy work between 2003 and 2008, I mean. I noticed that people from my neighborhood would show up over and over and over again. Friends of mine who I grew up with, you know, I'm from Chicago, South Side, whatever. And I wanted to know why why everybody in that spot, so many people look like me? You know, what was behind these statistics that I didn't yet know? The fact that Black men are 5 times more likely to be arrested for the same crimes, by the way, or incarcerated for the same crimes than white men, that they're twice as likely to be arrested, they do more time, 10% on average in state facilities, 20% on average in federal facilities. What does this? What produces this? How do we get it? And so I went to social work school to be a better chaplain. I thought that's what I wanted to do with my life. But eventually I went and did a PhD in sociology because I wanted to study the structure that helps to produce these things, that gets around questions of decision making. Anyway, long story short, through my studies, I realized that if I was honest, I would be in my own model. I would be in it. I was born in the mass incarceration generation. I was born poor and Black after 1972. And then while I was doing my work, by the way, my brother was arrested and incarcerated. He was locked up. And so about a third of the book, I spend time wrestling with what it means to care for my brother. So in doing this work of caring for my brother while I'm studying people caring for their brothers and sisters, families, loved ones, et cetera, I realized that there were things that I learned when I allowed myself access to the feeling of caring for him, to the miseries and joys and pains of it. When I allowed myself to get proximate, to get close, I realized I started seeing things that other people didn't see. You know, this is another reason why the attention to these questions rather than say just the prison. The reason why the guys in most of the guys in my book, there's only one innocent person in the book. You know, the wrestling with innocence and guilt and debt and how and why we use these frames to understand people as if they capture anybody's life in any meaningful way. It's allowing myself to be close both to my own feelings and emotions, but also to the people in the book who I follow, being with them, sitting with them like a dear friend who might sit with you at a funeral. You know, our Jewish brothers and sisters sit Shiva with each other. They mourn together. And they're not always talking. You know, when my grandmother died, my grandmother raised me, she died when I was 18. And I felt alone in the world. And my dearest friends were the ones who were just with me during that time, not offering advice necessarily, not telling me what to do, not psychologizing me, you know, not using the latest therapeutic or clinical language. They were just there with me together. And they learned things about me through those losses, as I've learned things about my dearest friends now through their losses, through being together, walking alongside one another, supporting when necessary, easing back when it makes the most sense. Not only does it help me, does it help the person who's mourning, who's in pain, who's in trouble, who needs help, who needs a lifeline. Not only does it help them, but the person who's being helped learns something about themselves and the people who are caring for them. And the person who is helping learns something about themselves and the condition, the human condition that they're intervening in. And so I'm calling for a sociology of being together, a study of where the method is to walk alongside the person who you're spending time with, and also getting in touch with your own feelings, with yourself, with what it means to be in a space in a moment in time, because it provides a different kind of insight and gives us access not only to a different view of the problem, but it also allows us to see something of the dynamic lives that people find and make for themselves, even under these conditions. I'm answering these questions way too long, but one of the things I'd like to say about this idea of a dynamic life, you know, the thing that really helped me write this book, if it's successful at all, it was also attending to the joys and celebrations that people had, the moments of victory as well as the moments of defeat. You know, and you see that in some of the chapters, particularly in the chapter I call Power. But being together reveals both kinds of oppression, new kinds of oppression that we haven't attended to, but also the dynamic lives that people find even in the wake of the sort of situations that close in on them.
I think the discussion throughout both the methodological moves that you make and this recurring reminder of the importance of proximity was so striking to me throughout the book, but it especially, I think, really started to hit home for me when you said in the book that mass incarceration is a problem of citizenship. Because what that focus on citizenship, you had done the work through proximity, through sitting together, through attention to common life, you know, the joys, the tragedies. And I felt like that methodological approach of being together gave you an important insight, as I read the book, at least, into this issue of citizenship, which when I read that line that mass incarceration is a problem of citizenship, it made me think of all the other ways that we explain, you know, mass incarceration. Like there's just, you know, and I'm, you know, as someone who's written on mass incarceration, like I am one of those people, like trying to explain all the different, you know, which policy was it, or which economic feature of our, you know, of the Reagan era, or what, you know, which particular move that was made. And I just love to hear you said this phrase in your reading, but just talk a little bit about that line, the problem of citizenship. What's going on there, and how does that reframe the issue of incarceration and its afterlives?
I appreciate that very much. I mean, so for me, I've written about this in like a law review paper and some sociology papers too. But what for me, I wanted to think about so one question might be, what is citizenship? You know, and so we might view citizenship as legal standing, as legal status. And this is how we typically talk about citizenship, especially when we're talking about, for example, people who are undocumented. You know, you are not a citizen of this particular nation state. You don't belong in this place where we've drawn boundaries under certain circumstances with our pistols and our purses, right? And we enforce these boundaries in particular ways, and you do not belong. You are not one of us. You weren't born across this border, and therefore, you don't have the legal status, you don't have the legal standing, you don't have the protections. But now through the literature, and so you know, starting with the literature in political science, the literature in legal theory, the literature in sociology certainly thinks about citizenship as more than a legal status, but citizenship is something that we live out every day. Citizenship is constructed through everyday interactions. It happens when I go to the store. This is why Black folks in this country were considered second-class citizens. You had the legal standing, but you couldn't actualize it because sets of things like Jim Crow laws, and after that, the stigma of Blackness that follows you in particular kinds of ways. And now we're trying to think about the status and the protections and the suite of rights available to Black people because of all these police murders that we're attending to now. You know, police killing people on camera, doing the things that they've done forever. But it raises questions about the protections that are afforded some groups and not others. And it raises questions about second-class citizenship because the legal status is there, but it's not actualized for you, whoever the you are. You know, the protections that aren't available to our Asian American brothers and sisters who are murdered now and historically, who are assaulted on trains and as they walk to school, who are chided by children who pull their eyes and talk about them in those ways. The same protections aren't available to Native American people who are killed at higher rates by police than any other racial or ethnic group, including Black Americans, but we don't pay any attention to it. Legal status, a sovereignty, a kind of sovereignty that's afforded and accorded to them with a set of rights and privileges they're also supposed to be able to access, but they've been completely invisibilized. So it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter in any formal sense. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. So this is the second class, right? So one way to think about it is whether or not you are able to, because of some problem, if we just notice it, access your rights as a citizen. But when I think about citizenship, what is it? It's rights, it's responsibilities, it's restrictions, it's benefits. It's a whole suite of things that denote You belong to us, whoever the us is. It is about belonging in a political sense to a political community. But at the end of the day, it's about belonging to a human community, being a human participant in a human community. And what we've done, what we've managed to do, I think, is make it so that entire groups of people never have a place where they belong in the social worlds that we've made. And this is why there are these egregious abuses of what we would call their rights as human beings. This is why the subprime mortgage companies can target my grandmothers and nobody bats an eye until the financial collapse happens. And then we come with the explanation. You took out a loan you knew you couldn't afford. Right? It's your behavior. If we think about people with criminal records, 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions target them and no one else. There are 80 million Americans with a criminal record, by the way. 1 in 2 families in this country are connected. 1 in 2 people in this country are connected, have a loved one who's been to an American jail or prison in this country. This is a giant American problem. But people with criminal records are met by 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions. People who walk out of a prison are handed a sheet of paper that have conditions of release. These are things that compel them to do things other people can't be compelled to do. We all work and teach and all these things on college campuses. Now, some schools may have codes that allow us to ask different kinds of questions. But if I tried to drug test every student that walked into the hallways of the University of Chicago, I'd have every fancy lawyer on this side of the country making sure I don't have a job tomorrow. Because I can't compel you to take a drug test, but if you have a criminal record, I can't. I can't compel you to go to treatment. You might need it. I might say, hey, you know, you're suffering from some sort of problem that I've identified. You must go to treatment 3 or 4 times a week. I can notice that you have a problem, but I can't compel you to go because you have freedom of movement, freedom of association. The conditions of release are sheets of paper that are lists of things that tell people with criminal records what they must do on top of the things they can't do. These are laws on top of laws. So 45,000 laws for them and them only, then handed a sheet of paper, laws on top of laws. So there's the rule side of it, the restriction side of it, the sanctions, laws and policies say you may not rent an apartment, you may not work. Whole categories of employment, 19,000 separate employment regulations in our country that target people with criminal records. There's that side of it. There's the restriction side of it. And then there are benefits that we can have a conversation about. For example, ministries that target people who are formerly incarcerated, services designed to, if you have a certain risk score, these are fairly perverse benefits. By perverse, I mean they don't outweigh the weight of the restriction, of course, but there are best attempts to undo the world that we've made, at least in the lives of these few people. So in a formal sense, folks don't have the same rights. They have different sets of rights. They live under different kinds of rules that target only them. That's in a formal sense. And on the informal side of things, there's the stigma of a criminal record that restricts their movement. There's the guilt that we lay on folks at folks' feet. There's the treatment of folks. There's the inability of us to make a space for them if we think there's someone who we should be afraid of. So we can pass laws. We can pass policies, we can design whole programs, we can let people out of jail or prison if they're a nonviolent, non-sexual, non-serious offender, but we don't even think about anything related to them if they've committed a violent offense. This, by the way, is half the prison. So anyway, this is why citizenship, it's the formal stuff, but it's also the informal stuff. And this question about places where you belong, just to answer this question very quickly, the policy mechanisms that we've enacted have made it so that not only will the person with the record be restricted for example, the housing market, but the person who helps them, the grandmother who lets them sleep on the couch, can be evicted if she gives quarter to the person with a criminal record. So we've made an entire pariah class out of folks who have criminal records. This to me is this point about belonging. We've made no place for them, not even in our imaginations, not if they've caused us harm or have the potential to cause us harm.
So good, Dr. Miller. I'm gonna squeeze one more question by combining two. You've already talked about sort of these inherent contradictions or limits really of the reentry programs or the ministries that you spent a great deal of time with. And so my question, I really want to just direct this to the participants on the call. I've heard, a lot of people when trying to wrestle with these ideas saying, well, it's the choices that people make that forfeit, their rights. I hear what you're saying, but if people wouldn't, commit crimes, they wouldn't be subjected to the situations you're describing. But throughout your book, you sort of detail the ways in which this narrative just isn't correct. And through proximity, we might come to understand the real lives of people who are impacted, for generations to come. And that's a whole another question. But in light of that, I would love to hear you talk just a little bit about how churches and faith-based institutions could better equip believers to move beyond individualistic reform. In your book, you talk about personal responsibility, tenacity, and grit, or volunteering in these ministries, which are obviously important, and you say so, and posture shift into a more active participation in restoring the rights of citizens and saying this isn't right and this isn't even helpful. But what would you say to Christians who think that that kind of work is too political?
I appreciate that very much. I would say we have to think carefully about our Christianity. This is what I would say. Redemption is a real life thing for everybody but the people we don't like. Like it's really easy to think about redemption for me. I'm at the cross crying, bawling my eyes out at the altar because I've made this or that mistake, and everybody understands it now. Make me a sex offender, and see where it goes. Jesus says, I'm at Wheaton. I can talk freely about Jesus, man. Like Jesus says, it's easy to love people who love you. That's the easy part. So one, I'd like for us to think carefully about our Christianity, and for these, it's so interesting how things become metaphors. Folks who have literal interpretations of Scripture, it becomes metaphor when it comes to the poor. They become metaphors. All these scriptures about caring for the poor, all these scriptures about freedom for the captive, all these scriptures about loving mercy. That's presuming people did something wrong. So I'm presuming people have done something wrong. All these scriptures become metaphors for folks who I'm afraid of. That's a powerful indictment of where we are in time and space, not only in this country, but our witness for the world. Powerful. I think that's a powerful indictment. But I'd like to call our attention to another fact, that 95% of all cases in this country are resolved through plea deals, which means nobody has their day in court, which means there's no fact finding, no truth telling. I'd also like to call our attention to the fact that most victims of crimes, when surveyed, say they didn't want the assailant to go to jail or prison, maybe not for the time. They certainly wanted some voice, but we've created an apparatus that we pretend is not in the world, that we pretend is a free-floating thing, free from the trappings of the rest of the world. The criminal justice system is just and pure in all its ways. You must have done something wrong. There have been 2,800 exonerations since 1989. Mary, you're working on a case now. That's what I heard on you're working on a case right now. 2,800 You know how much effort it takes. I mean, obviously, you both know. Aaron, you write about this thing, like mass incarceration in the church and our positions on it. And anyway, I think we need more mercy and less fire and brimstone. I think we need more grace. The same grace we extend to ourselves, we should extend to our brothers and sisters. And a kind of radical doubt and skepticism when we think about the machinations of the state. If the state can get it wrong on policies that we disagree with, freedom of religion or something like that. Like, what's the stickler thing? Whether or not abortion is the right thing. What's the stickler thing? The state can get it wrong there, but it doesn't get it wrong with 2.3 million people who are locked away. It doesn't make any sense. I think we have to think carefully about our Christianity. We have to think carefully about our witness. We have to think carefully about our ethical commitments one to another, even the people who may have caused us harm. And this is the world that we're to rebuild. Right? The question is, what kind of world do we want? Do we want a world where we create pariahs and we leave them at the bottom, or do we want a world where the captives are free? That's the question. And what do the captives need to be free? That's the question that we're not yet asking. So that's what I would say to the people who say it's their behaviors that got them there. I would say, tell that to the 2.3 million people in the prison, 2 million of which have copped a plea, who are looking at saying yes to 2 years in prison or going to trial with the possibility of going away for 77, 80, 90 years. In other words, who said yes in the face of a threat. Yeah.
Hey, Noah, I'm going to stop you. Can you mute your audio? Noah? I think everyone was hearing a very strange noise while you were speaking. I've never heard anything like that on a Zoom call before. So tell you what, I will run the Q&A for a minute. This is a time for, if you have a question and you want to drop it in the chat, that would be great. And I will, we'll take a look at it. Maybe for a second, while we're waiting for people to put a question in the chat, Reuben, could you just talk a little bit about the limits of reentry programs? Mm-hmm. Like the way, I mean, this is a really interesting move that you make in the book. Is I think you really showcase the power and the extremely noble intentions and work of people doing reentry ministry, while you also showcase some of the like problematic assumptions that drive that. And I would just love for maybe just like a minute or two, could you talk a little bit about that while we get a couple of questions in here?
No, absolutely. I can take this question and jump to our first question from the audience too, is about Wheaton College being able to do something tangible. So maybe we can blend these two, if that's okay, Aaron. And so reentry programs, the people who I ran into who ran reentry programs were beautiful people. You know, there was a wonderful quote that one of the executive directors would say, and he got it from he was Catholic, and it was a Catholic, I don't know if it was a saint or just some important person, some important priest, but every interaction is an opportunity for an encounter with the divine, is what he would say. Every interaction is an opportunity for an encounter with the divine. And he premised the Episcopal priest in this case, who formed the organization I was hanging out in, premised one of the organizations I was hanging out in, premised the ministry on just a radical is not a bad word, but understanding of hospitality. So what he did was he took people home and he let them sleep in the basement of his home when they get out of jail or prison. And this turned into a giant and beautiful ministry that also showed great effectiveness in reducing recidivism, increasing the stability of people in the long term, this kind of thing. And so reentry programs and prison ministries can do the important work of providing food, clothing, shelter, counsel, and care. You can't go through a decade in prison without walking out with some scars. You need somebody to talk to. Everybody needs somebody to talk to, by the way, not just people who've been through trauma and pain. And they can provide those things. But what they cannot do is they cannot address this question of citizenship, this problem of the legal infrastructure that excludes people with records from housing, work, jobs. So you can train people and prepare them for the worlds of work, but the second step has to be preparing the worlds of work for the people you're training. So there are 19,000 laws, policies, and sanctions that keep people out of the labor market. What Wheaton can do. Wheaton is an intellectual hub, and also a force sending people out to do good work. It could be, if it's not, should be, which means it can equip people to ask the right political questions, to think more carefully about where's the right place to intervene. It can hold politicians accountable for their positions on criminal justice. It can think carefully about the kinds of reform that are happening. If I were to do a practical thing, I would start with the 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that I think animate the book. And I would ask myself a simple question: do we need 45,000? Which ones do we need to make ourselves feel safe? And then I ask myself a tougher question, because this is a university. Why do those things make me feel safe? How am I defining my safety? These conversations are necessary. Holding politicians accountable. This is the kind of place where you could do that very important work, and sending people out to do the good everyday tasks of making sure people have food, clothes, and shelter are also incredibly important.
Great. So Mia asks a question that since this is we're already in territory that is just undeniably political, so let's just dig in even more. Mia asks, how would you recommend advocating for policies that expand citizenship for formerly incarcerated citizens in very red states? It's frustrating to see great legislation proposed but never passed. And I might just add on to this, even today, a senator from the state of Arkansas announced that we do not incarcerate enough people in this country. And so I think Mia asks a really important question, like, where do you recommend starting here? And yeah, how would you go about doing that work?
Well, I'm a guest. I can just speak my mind. Tom Cotton is feels like a fool to me. That's certainly a foolish statement. And it doesn't accord with any of the social science, which says that mass incarceration at best, like our over incarceration of people over these many years at best, has had a tiny, super modest effect on crime rates in this country. But anyway, I can speak my mind. I'm a guest. It's all good. It is what it is. I think that brother's a fool. Having said that, he said some other foolish things too. Having said that, the red states are where we see lots of innovation. So, for example, a commitment to drug courts. I think there are some problems. Like, you have to be very careful with how you're regulating people's lives. But there have been very interesting moves for bail reform in states like Oklahoma. There've been very interesting moves in decriminalizing drug use in places like Texas. So we can look to the red states and see where people are playing around the edges. Now, what typically happens is people become more sympathetic when it's their children who are on the chopping block. So the methamphetamine addictions, opioid addictions, these kinds of things have opened up a new discussion about what should be criminalized. I think it's egregious that it took largely white children for the country to start caring about drug use and drug users. Ethically, I think that's terrible, but it's an opening. It's a door. Let's take it. Because the truth of the matter is that while 38% of that prison is Black, 38% of that prison is white. And so whatever the door is, I'm going to take that door. I'm happy to take it because it's an American dilemma. So anyway, the red states have been places of real innovation. And I think that I'm hoping that noticing the 45,000 laws, policies, administrative sanctions will make people who care about things like the overregulation of social life. I hope it'll make the hair on their arms stand up. And by the way, thankfully, it really has. People from, right-leaning think tanks have certainly reached out to me and folks who do this kind of work. And And if you look at some organizations, there's some models for working across political divides. If you look at organizations like the Vera Institute for Justice that runs all these very interesting pilot programs around things like housing and housing policy, they're not just running those in New York, they're running them in Louisiana too. And so I don't think the appetite, I think we need a reframing of the questions so that folks, that it resonates with things that people think matter and are valuable. But I don't think a fundamental transformation of the system is impossible just because somebody checks an R or a D, at the ballot box. In fact, the R's and the D's have been the problem together since we've been a country. So.
All right. Well, we are out of time. I really just want to encourage all of you. You've just gotten a little taste of the power and the insight that's in this book, Halfway Home. And I want to commend it to you. It is a book that teaches, I think it will teach incredibly well for professors, students. You should ask your professors to use it. I'm going to use it this fall in one of my courses. And I think, since we're here at Wheaton, as Reuben mentioned, like, this is a book for church groups. This is a book for you and your small group to dig through and dig into, and to see the power of these stories and the important questions that Reuben raises. So I just commend this to you. I want to, since Noah can't give the farewell here because of his sound issues, I'll do it. But on behalf of the Center for Urban Engagement, thanks so much, Dr. Miller, for being with us. It's just really a joy to have you with us. Thanks to Mary as well. And I want to just real quick give a shout out to Noah and Carrie for putting this on. And please mark your calendars for this fall and for next year. We have a whole just exciting list of speakers, including Jim Sullivan, A.K. Sandoval Strauss. I'm going to be there for some reason speaking. I encourage you just to be on the lookout for those. But with that, thank you, everyone. Please have a good night. And thanks again, Dr. Miller, for this wonderful book and conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.